Today we're going to talk about Rachel Maddow. Rachel Maddow has pretty much lost her mind, and Rachel Maddow has probably spent more time talking about the Russian collusion story than anybody in media anywhere. By her own admission, she even says that. And the problem is that she's never right. And if you look back at some of the crazy announcements that she's made and her paranoia about what's going to happen next, she has not been right ever. She just has an incredible ability to weave together partial stories, bits of information, put a little spin on it, leave out something, leave out pertinent facts, and then go on with it to make her point. And last night, this is right now, I'm talking about this about a week after the Kavanaugh hearing when he was put into the Supreme Court. She went from the Supreme Court issue being the big news of the day back to this, the old story. This is a story about Alpha Bank and its alleged connection to the Trump campaign and Russian collusion and all this. And she weaves together such a pile of fucking bullshit, you can't believe it. And the articles that she's going to quote refute what she's saying. But that doesn't bother her because she has a story to tell and she's going to run with it. And I'm going to go through this with you real quickly and you'll see what I'm saying.
For my money, though, the single most fascinating story in all of this is what has just been reported by veteran investigative journalist Dexter Filkins at The New Yorker. Just before the presidential election on Halloween, October 31st, 2016, Franklin Foer published this fascinating and very controversial piece at slate.com. And honestly, it has been driving me nuts ever since. We've talked about this reporting a few other times on the show. You might remember it was about logs of internet traffic, logs of communication between different computers on the internet that appeared to show frequent and somewhat inexplicable contact all of a sudden during the presidential campaign between a computer server at the Trump Organization and a computer server at a Russian bank called Alpha Bank. Alpha is the biggest private bank in Russia. They have
For those of you that don't know what pinging is something that all servers do on a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis around the world. And all it is they send out data around the web, around the globe, not only to, I'm sure, everything connected to the Trump Organization, but to us as well. We have 3 websites. They get pinged constantly by Russian servers, by Chinese servers. They don't do anything. All it is it's a validation that the address they have for that server is correct, all right? And often information ends up on a server somewhere created by spam email that's sent out from different sources, goes somewhere, and there's a record of that link, and then the servers begin pinging it to ensure that that link is still there, that there's still a site there. It's an automated process.
friendly relations with the Kremlin. You don't get to be big anything in Russia without friendly relations with the Kremlin. Alpha Bank is mentioned in the Christopher Steele dossier that was published to such great controversy right before the inauguration. Executives from Alpha Bank actually went on to sue BuzzFeed for publishing the dossier because the dossier does mention this Alpha Bank. Just a couple of months ago in August, that lawsuit against BuzzFeed was dismissed in a U.S. court.
All right, a couple of things about Alpha Bank. Alpha Bank is a pretty old bank. It was started back before Boris Yeltsin was the head of Russia. And it was founded by a couple of Russian guys who have long since moved out of Russia and live in the UK and have really nothing to do with the Russian government. They're actually sort of well known for that. They have said in repeated interviews that they run their business. They try not to violate any rules in Russia. They are not particularly close to Putin. They avoid him because of his history. And that the case was dropped. They brought the case because Mr. Steele here, the spy who went to work for the DNC with illegal money funneled through a Washington law firm who hired Fusion GPS, an opposition research company, he concocted this story and he threw Alpha Bank into it, all right, for some reason that nobody can figure out. It may just be because it's a big Russian bank, I suspect is the main reason. But they sued him because they had nothing to do with this. They have nothing to do with Putin, and they don't know what he's talking about. But the case got dismissed because we have freedom of press in this country. And at the time, the Trump dossier, when it was released to the media, was certainly publishable, though nobody believed it. And Rachel knows that, but that doesn't matter. She just wanted to toss that in.
For what it's worth, I should tell you that one of the billionaire founders of Alpha Bank has a daughter. Not that long ago, his daughter married Alex van der Zwaan. Crazy, right? One of the only people who's gone to jail so far in the Mueller investigation. Probably all just a big coinky-dink.
Alex van der Zwaan went to jail because he was Manafort's attorney and helped him launder money back in the 2012-2014 era. And when he was asked about it by the FBI, what his relationship was with Manafort, he didn't come clean and tell them everything. Nothing he did was illegal, apparently. None of his activities were illegal, but he got 30 days at a club fed in upstate Pennsylvania for not being forthcoming with the FBI when they asked him about Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort, as you know, was involved and has been convicted of various financial crimes going back long before any connection with the Trump organization. And Trump actually fired him a couple of months after taking him on to help run his campaign because he didn't trust him. All right. So it's sort of odd that she would bother to throw that in. But we continue.
But for whatever reason, at the height of the campaign in 2016, a server used by that bank kept making contact with a server at the Trump organization. When that server was being used for almost nothing else, why was it communicating with a Russian bank? It's a vexing little mystery.
Rachel knows, and as the fellow she's quoting knows and stated in his article, that pinging is not actually communicating. It's just verifying an IP address on the internet. And if she had an inch of fucking integrity, she would have read this. This is in the Slate article, the original one that got her so interested. Our experts have conducted a detailed analysis of alleged internet traffic and did not find any evidence that it included any actual communications, no emails, chat, text, etc., between Spectrum Health, which is the DeVos family website, Alpha Bank, or any of the Trump organizations. While we did find a small number of incoming spam marketing emails, they originated from a digital marketing company called Sendin, advertising Trump hotels. Okay, that's the big communication. In other words, they were spam. The Trump hotels, as you know, and every business does, you get them every day in the email. You get spam from people. Well, to Rachel Maddow, this is fucking the smoking gun. All right, so let's just continue. It gets worse.
Ever since Franklin Foer first reported on it for Slate.com 2 years ago, Halloween night, right before the 2016 election, it has been a very controversial piece of reporting. Well, now, Dexter Filkins at The New Yorker has picked that up and run with it. And, you know, even if you have felt like this is one of those confusing stories, one of those sidebar stories about the Russia investigation that seems too technical and you're not sure you get it, pick up a copy of The New Yorker or go to newyorker.com. Just print out this Dexter Filkins article. Don't read it online. Print it out. Read it on paper. Read it in a quiet moment. One of the blessings here is that Dexter Filkins is a very, very good writer. And I promise you, even if you have been mystified by this story before, you will be intrigued by it the way that he has written it up. And
Filkins is a pretty good writer, but his article doesn't actually make her argument for her. And if we click over to it really quickly, it says here, this is all based off of a story written by a guy you're going to learn a lot more about in a minute, named Lichtblau, Eric Lichtblau. All right, and Eric Lichtblau is one of the most discredited journalists around these days, and we'll talk about why in a minute. In a meeting in late September 2016, a room full of officials told Lichtblau, I don't say which officials or even what country they're from, we're looking into a potential Russian interference in the election. There's no mention of the Trump organization. The Bureau had intelligence from informants suggesting a possible connection between the Trump organization and Russian banks, but no data. The information from Max's group, he was a fellow technology guy doing the research. The FBI was looking for people in the U.S. who were helping Russia to influence the election. Now, that investigation began in 2014, long before Trump even announced he was running, because they were checking out interference by the Russians that they conducted in 2012, okay? They had intelligence from informants suggesting a possible connection, all right? The problem was that none of those informants panned out for them, and some are suspecting it was a bullshit story to begin with. All right, and as a result, Dean Baquet, okay, the Times executive editor, decided it would not suffice to report the existence of computer contacts without knowing their purpose. In other words, if it's just pinging, we're not going to report on that. Baquet thought he could not publish the story without being more confident in its conclusions. In other words, the article was full of shit. He didn't buy it. Over time, the FBI's interest in the possibility of Alpha Bank connections seemed to wane. It seemed to wane because they realized that Alpha Bank had no connections with the Russian government. And then in the end, they published this story. Investigating Donald Trump, FBI sees no clear link to Russia. And as you remember later, Comey came out and said that was the case. But does that matter to Rachel? No, she's going to run on with it like it was some bigger kind of cover-up. Watch what she does.
I'm going to let him tell you the story, but just to prepare you for that conversation, here's a few things that he sort of blew the lid off here with this piece in the New Yorker. Number one, turns out that at the same time Franklin Foer was pursuing this story at the very end of the presidential campaign in 2016, the New York Times had been pursuing it too. Investigative reporter for the Times named Eric Lichtblau had the story and was working on it even before Franklin Foer started working on it for Slate. As part of reporting that story, Eric Lichtblau at the Times apparently came to learn that the FBI had an open counterintelligence investigation underway into possible contacts between people associated with then presidential candidate Donald Trump and Russia. Oh, which...
Now, remembering what I just said, that's not actually what they said at all, okay? Let's go back over to this. Possible interest in the bank, Alpha Bank, okay? And here it is. A roomful of officials told Lichtblau they were looking into potential Russian interference in the election, all right? She had it as a quote that they were looking into collusion between the Russians and the Trump organization. No, it was just interference with the election itself. The Bureau had intelligence from an informant suggesting a possible connection, but they didn't have any data. The FBI was looking into people in the U.S. who were helping the Russians, all right? They did not verify at any time, okay, that Trump was being investigated. But that doesn't bother Rachel. She'll continue. Because that's just how this fucking person...
Which means, before the election, the New York Times was in possession of the story that there was an open FBI counterintelligence investigation into Trump and Russia.
There she goes. That's a fucking lie, all right? No, they had an open investigation that they have since talked about that began in 2014 into collusion between Russia and people in the U.S., but not specifically by any measure the Trump organization, which has since been proven to be true, all right? And Comey said so, if you all remember. But at any rate, Rachel doesn't give a shit about that. This is how she weaves a story. It's amazing.
Before the election. Did I mention that they knew this before the election? Remember that headline about Donald Trump being the subject of an open FBI counterintelligence investigation about him and his campaign's contacts with Russia right before the election, the one that blew the lid off the election and changed it? No, the New York Times did not run that story, even though they knew that counterintelligence investigation was underway. New York Times instead ran this rather infamous story, also on October 31st, which basically said, yeah, you know, the FBI looked into some stuff about Trump. People have been asking questions about Russia and stuff. Turns out it's all fine. There's nothing there.
It was all fine, and there was nothing there, and the allegation was absolute bullshit. And this is what the editor, chief editor of the New York Times realized, and they could not run with that story because there wasn't any evidence to support it. The New York Times had no information, as they said, that there was a connection. And this was all coming, bear in mind, this is from Eric Lichtblau. And Eric Lichtblau is a pretty nefarious character, and you're gonna remember who he is in just a minute. He is a liberal operative, that's for sure, but he's also dishonest as hell. He's almost as dishonest as Rachel Maddow. But we're going to continue.
That's That's the story they ran on October 31st, when the Times knew at that moment, through its own reporting, that actually an FBI counterintelligence investigation into these contacts had begun and stood open. And they knew that directly because the FBI asked their own reporter, Eric Lichtblau, to hold off on some of what he had to report about this Alpha Bank thing because they were looking into it too, and they didn't want it to interfere with their ongoing counterintelligence investigation.
No, they asked him not to go with it because it was a bullshit story and could upset the election. Remember, you were a month and a half away from the election, and this is a false story, and the FBI certainly didn't want to be tied to it because Lichtblau was going to say that they were doing this, which they were not doing. And the New York Times editor agreed with them. They were not doing it.
So they knew. I love me the New York Times. As far as I'm concerned, the New York Times is the eighth wonder of the world. I do not want to imagine an America without the New York Times or with a lesser New York Times. But when it comes to how they handled the information that they had about FBI interest in the two presidential candidates in 2016, at some point there presumably will have to be a little bit of a come to Jesus moment about that, because that is a heck of a thing for the New York Times to have sat on and not published. The
New York Times didn't sit on it because they had nothing to sit on, Rachel. That's the fucking point, you dumb twat. All right. As for Mr. Lichtblau and his crew, they were so outraged after that article was published that he was bylined on. He quit the New York Times and went to work for CNN. And before we get back to Rachel and her absurd ramblings, let's take a good look at Mr. Lichtblau. He went to work for CNN, where they formed a special unit to do investigative journalism. And one of the targets of his investigative journalism was Mr. Scaramucci. And you remember Mr. Scaramucci ended up suing CNN for publishing a false story that they had to retract and threatening to sue them for $85 or $100 million. As a result, the three journalists who were involved with starting this new investigative unit, they were just crushed by reporting errors and threatened with lawsuits and litigation. They had to retract several stories that were absolutely untrue, and they got in a shit ton of trouble. All right. Terrence Burke had startling news. 3 of their colleagues, including the team's executive editor, that would be Mr. Lichtblau, were leaving the network in the wake of a retracted article about Russia and a close ally of President Trump. Effective immediately, Burke said the team would stop publishing stories while managers reviewed what went or what had gone wrong. Within months of its introduction, the unit, this is the one that Mr. Lichtblau was tasked with starting along with Jake Tapper and some other clowns at CNN, had been rocked by damaging reports, including another flawed story about Mr. Trump and Russia earlier in June, and its mistakes had disturbed network executives who were already embroiled in a public feud with the White House. All right, and then on to here. Sources also said 3 journalists responsible for the retracted story, Tom Frank, editor Eric Lichtblau, there he is, that's the guy from the New York Times that wanted to run the bogus story that his editor wouldn't let him run, who headed the investigative unit, were all urged to resign. In other words, that's a polite way of saying quit or you're going to get fired. The CNN had to pay them off on their contracts, but they were looking at a $100 million lawsuit from Mr. Scaramucci. So that was the end of Mr. Lichtblau. Oddly, he got a job back at the New York Times after this mess, all right? And this was the other story that Mr. Lichtblau got in trouble for. He ran a story saying that FBI Director Comey was expected to dispute President Trump's claims that Comey said he was not under investigation on multiple occasions. Lichtblau ran with the story that Mr. Comey would come out publicly and refute Trump's claims. And as you all know, he did exactly the opposite. He came out and said that it's true that Trump was not under investigation. And you can go to the Hill and you can read the whole article. All right. But the point is that Mr. Lichtblau is just a fucking fraud and a bullshit artist. And this broad knows it. Okay. Rachel Maddow knows this guy is dishonest. He left the New York Times because the Times wouldn't publish something that was dishonest. He went to CNN and started a new investigative unit there, and he was fired and kicked out within a couple of months after having to retract several major stories and get threatened with a $100 million lawsuit. All right. So let's continue.
Especially given how dead the horse was they were aggressively beating at the time every day when it came to Hillary Clinton's emails. They knew Trump was the subject of a counterintelligence investigation at the FBI at the time, and they didn't tell us?
No, Rachel, they didn't know that. And as it was shown later, he wasn't under investigation. And you know that. But you don't care, because you still want to keep it alive. But remember, Mr. Comey later came out and said Trump was not under investigation at the time, nor was his organization. They were looking into links between Russians and other Americans who might have helped influence the election. But you're just a fucking liar, so let's just keep going.
The Times has sort of apologized for that Halloween 2016 story since it ran. They've never run a correction. They sort of explained that their own disappointment in it. But now we know. The Times knew. Trump was under active FBI counterintelligence investigation before the election. They didn't publish it.
Again, reiterate the lie enough times and people will stick with that, okay? Rachel, no, they didn't. The New York Times wouldn't publish it, and Comey refuted the whole story later. Thank God the New York Times didn't print it, because it would have made them look bad or worse than they already do. But let's continue.
The Times also effectively killed what would have been corroborating reporting from Eric Lichtblau on that strange thing about Alpha Bank and the Trump organization.
The problem is that Eric Lichtblau is a discredited reporter and left the New York Times, went to CNN, and further wrecked his career by making up shit about other people and other stories that had to be retracted. Oh, Rachel, you forgot that part. Let's continue.
Organization servers, which Franklin Foer ended up reporting all on his own at Slate to so much controversy. These odd communications between a Russian bank server and the Trump server, their reporting could have corroborated that too.
No, it couldn't, because pinging isn't communication, Rachel, you dumb bitch, all right? This is what the viewers don't understand. She goes around in circles and keeps regurgitating the same nonsense, but it's completely devoid of any facts. Facts, Rachel, all right? The information I'm putting up here, I found on the internet in under 10 minutes, and I suspect her staff could have done it in under 3. But she doesn't give a shit because it goes against her narrative, which she's trying so desperately to put out here in 9 minutes.
For this New Yorker piece, Eric Lichtblau told Filkins, quote, "Not only is there clearly something there, but there's clearly something that someone has gone to great lengths to conceal."
Again, he's relying on Lichtblau, the guy that his own editors didn't believe at the New York Times, okay? But the New Yorker is even further to the left than the New York Times, so Mr. Filkins is going to run with it. But he crafts this article very carefully. If you read it, there's not actually much in it, but it's lots of innuendo, and that's just what Rachel Maddow loves.
That's not what the Times published, but that's what their reporter found. Dexter Filkins also for the first time explains in layman's terms what kind of communications, what kind of interactions between someone in Russia and someone at the Trump Organization might have produced the kind of internet data that led to all of this reporting. And I will let him explain that in just a moment, because
as he points out to you, Rachel, that data on itself means nothing because millions of servers around the world send out packets and ping other servers all the time, especially banks. And as I said, our own websites here get pinged in perpetuity, and our names are nowhere near as big as anything connected to Trump during an election.
For me, that was kind of the aha moment. Finally, somebody has spelled out what this might have been. What would turn up looking like this in these internet logs? What kinds of communication, what amount of communication, what might have gone down here that produced this evidence?
As the original Slate article pointed out that Mr. Filkins relied upon, there were no communications other than pinging, Rachel. No emails, no chats, no texts. That's communication. There was none of that. These were all tiny little packets that you couldn't put a sentence into. But we continue.
But perhaps most importantly, where Dexter Filkins finally gets with this story is how this intrigue could finally one day end. How you could make this question one day have an answer. How this story and all of this intrigue and this particular mystery could finally be explained and put to bed. Quote, "This March, after Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee announced that they had found no evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. The committee's Democrats filed a dissent, arguing that there were many matters still to be investigated, including the Trump Organization's connections to Alpha Bank. The Democrats implored the majority Republicans to force a company involved in the communication between these servers, a company called Sendin, to turn over computer data that would help determine what had happened. Quote,
The data they're talking about is from Sendin. Remember them? They were the ones that send out the marketing. They're a marketing company, and they send out emails for Trump hotels. This is the company they think is the smoking gun. This is not something that needs to really be investigated in any particular way because it had already been done by Slate. All right? What this is a fishing expedition to try and find anything in absolute desperation to try and get some goods on Trump. The FBI has looked into it. The Mueller investigation, I'm sure, has looked into it. And they've come up with nothing. All right? And the Mueller investigation now, and Rachel is in a panic, is winding down. The top two attorneys below Mueller himself have left, gone back to their regular jobs. The Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee have all seen basically everything that Mueller has because they've been running their own investigations. And all of them have said to a man that they haven't seen anything that links the two together. And this includes Democrats. A year and a half ago, nuts like Schiff out in California were on CNN and MSNBC almost on a nightly basis, making wild-eyed claims about collusion. You haven't seen them lately because they've seen the information too, and they've got a career to think about, and they're going to look like total assholes when this all is resolved. But for Rachel, you just got to keep digging, no matter what.
Those records could show who in the Trump Organization used the server. There would probably also be a record of who shut down the Trump domain after the Times contacted Alpha Bank for comment on its reporting. Sendin might also have records of any outgoing communications sent by the Trump Organization. Quote, but such a request for further investigation is
So now Sendin is the secret link. It's an email marketing spammer. Is the secret link between the Trump Organization and Alpha Bank, which has virtually no connection to the Russian government, according to all sources involved. But that's okay. It's a Russian bank, and all it needs to have is an R in front of their name, and oh, well, it's a bad thing. But no, Rachel, there's nothing there, and that's why this hasn't been in the news and means nothing except for conspiracy theorists like you. You're the next Alex Jones, but we'll continue.
Likely to proceed as long as Republicans hold the majority. In other words, if there really was the story that's been so intriguing for 2 years now, if there really was a secret line of communication set up between Trump Tower and Moscow during the election, when they tried to cover up, that could be sort of the missing link in terms of figuring out how involved the Trump campaign was in the Russian effort to interfere in the election on Trump's behalf. And if anybody really wants to figure out whether that secret line of communication was there, it's doable.
Again, Rachel, your hypothesis is rubbish for one big reason. The people that Filkins relied upon, they were a bunch of internet geeks, really. They were very good at investigating. All of them came back and said, we've examined all of the packets, all of the data, all of the alleged communication, and none of it is anything more than pinging. It's pinging. That's it. About as innocuous as anything can be on the internet. And but to her, there still could be more to the story. Never let a good story die, Rachel, especially if it feeds your narrative. But you're looking like an ass.
You could figure it out. They could probably do it with just a couple of subpoenas. And in fact, if Democrats win the House 4 weeks from tonight, it looks like Democrats are ready to go with subpoenas to get that information, which means we'd finally have an answer. Now, one does, of course, wonder if Robert Mueller and his prosecutors have already beaten the Democrats there, either before Dexter Filkins published this piece or since it has been out. But Dexter Filkins joins us next. Stay with us.
And that's the end of it. And this is another one of Rachel's big stories that's going to really put the kibosh on the Trump administration. She's fucking crazy is what it amounts to. And if you go back and look at most of her claims and then do your own Googling to look up what actually happened, you'll find gaping holes in it just like I found here. She totally contradicted everything that's been published. and skipped over completely the fact that the primary source of all this information, Mr. Lichtgau, is perhaps one of the most disreputed reporters around these days. Even his own editors don't trust him, and nearly caused CNN $100 million. But that's the way it is. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.